Thank you, Professor Balan. Incidentally, he was telling me, just as I came up on the stage, that you are going on a reverse gear. You're looking younger day by day, is what he said. And I reminded him that I've broken my spec and I can't see people sitting right here right now. It's all blurred. And I've been working with my eyes downcast for a couple of hours now so that people don't mistake me. You know, if I don't smile back at them, they will feel that, you know, I'm not responding or acting smart or something. And in short, what I'm going to share here is also as part of my experience. Homen and Sukhdev's invitation to me came in a moment when I was rethinking about my whole involvement in issues in Manipur for the last 15 years. There are reasons for this, and I was reminded a sort of an existential concern as I listened to Aloysius. What is that one can do, and what one must do, and what is your audience, who are the people you're fighting for whom you're speaking for, and what they have been doing all this while. All these issues have been part of my concern in the last 1 year particularly, and incidentally this, Homen was looking out for me, it seems, and he couldn't find me, and I was sitting in the back of the room. This is also part of the same moment when I'm rethinking about my positioning myself. Been intimately and very passionately involved for the last 12 years due to, by default, or you know, in Manipur we have a saying called illusion, I ended up in most of the issues that the state had faced in the last 11, 12 years behind the scene. And the topic that this seminar has picked up reminds me of a couple of things again in the last 1 month. There's Perry Anderson's book, The Indian Ideology, I'm sure Aloysius must have seen it. It's a 3 essays publication. Incidentally, Aloysius' very popular and widely read work, Nationalism Without Nation, is one of the prescribed texts in the course that I teach. It's a very important work according to me. I've been teaching this for the last 5 years, his book, along with Batu Chatterjee's Nation and its Fragment, and Assis Nandi's Illegitimacy of Nationalism as 3 vantage points of critically looking at the Indian state. And he has already set up the issues. I'm familiar with his work, and moreover, not only as an academic, but I'm also quite aware of his involvement in the Dalit movement. And he's, I should say, modest enough, he didn't mention the names of those sociologists who he said shamelessly defended the government of India. One of them turns out to be a close friend of mine and former colleague at JB. And deliberately, I teach his paper along with the counterpoints put up by the Dalit in the conference. So these are some of the moments that I want to preempt the audience and how you look at my presentations. Today morning I read the news something about the governor of Meghalaya saying something about Armed Forces Special Power Act. It took me back to a couple of years back. I was speaking in MU in a conference on civil-military relation. And I was struck by one thing. In my speech, I said that Indian Army is one of the finest professional army in the world. But the problem with you is that you are in the wrong job. That's what I told them. After I finished my speech, General Huda came up on the stage. It was not part of the planned procedure. And he said something like this. It's recorded. He said, I or my officials, my men are no under illusion that it is our job. This is not our job. Surprisingly, next morning, none of the newspaper picked up that statement. A statement made by a 2-star general, a field commander, saying that this is not our job in public on MU campus where TV cameras were all around. Instead of that, next day I found in 2 of the most popular newspapers, quoting from his earlier statement in his formal presentation, where he said, for the army to operate, we need OPSPA, General Huda. That was the headline. And I was wondering, how is that a state with so much history of fight against the Armed Forces Special Power Act could not hit the headline of that two-star general's confession that this is not our job? That news is what today hit the headline through the governor of Meghalaya. And I was thinking today as I was preparing this thing, that shows how do we understand our situations. AFSPA is in a very, very restricted sense. This is almost for 10 years that I've been saying, meeting after meeting, writing after writing, I said, Armed Forces Special Power Act is in a very restricted sense. It's a policy instrument, it's a policy decision. But the truth of the matter is, Armed Forces Special Power Act is a paradigm of government that introduces a state of exception to govern the other. This is very important for me, and I wanted to talk about it, why the Armed Forces Special Power Act becomes the state of exception as a paradigm of governing the other. And who are the other, how that other is created, has something to do with the notion of the Indian nation state and its racial inflection. Some of you younger scholars probably must have read one of my papers in Men in Society in ICSSR publication called From Indica to Bharat via India. I've written there in 2006, it came out in January. There also I've argued many of the things I'm going to say is going to be a repeat of the same. So I'm saying that in human rights discourse, the Armed Forces Special Power Act has been captured within a much more limited space of human rights discourse. And what happens is, therefore, anything that you think about AFSPA is the army has killed this, therefore whether you get compensation or justice for the death and so on and so forth. All arguments and around that. But when you go to the national media, then Barkha, that kind of people will position the victim of the militant and say that you also get killed by the other, they also have a victim of the militants. So the whole issue of AFSPA gets diffused in the process. And this happens precisely because that the discourses on AFSPA has been much more focused on a very, 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 very limited instrumental sense of human rights discourse. In a larger theoretical plane, I don't have time to go into it, that has something to do with the relationship between what academics would call it law and politics. There is a zone of indistinction between law and politics. And this is in Roland Dawkins' theory, one can always go for it in legal theory. And that particular sphere of indistinction is what I've been referring to as state of exception. I'll try to explain a little bit. What I've suggested so far in a nutshell is, why is it a particular way of looking at AFSPA is being missed out is because we have been conditioned within a very legalistic human rights discourse, not able to expand to the political realm, which is the act is actually. And this is what I'll try to share with you, how racism, the notion of the nation, and the Indian nation state gets implicated into this production of the other and the state of exception called AFSPA. In the process, we also try to briefly mention about, since Aloysius is here also. And the two processes, what is called inclusion by exclusion, which is the case of the Northeast, and the other is just the opposite, exclusion by inclusion. That's the case of the Dalit. And I'll try to explain this a little while ago. In order to do that, what we need to understand is the relationship between the nation-state, civilization, and the rest. And my paper title is Reflections on Exclusionary Politics. We must understand in human history, particularly in the 18th century onward, there is a conflation between two conceptual categories called state and the nation. I think Aloysius had mentioned as nation as a political category and a cultural category. But primarily, one must understand that there is a conflation of nation and the state. One documentary evidence of that could be the Article 3 of the French Declaration. And let me explain this thing, we need to understand this part. State and the nation is very important, and if we have just heard Aloysius saying something which is a similar kind of expression by a Mijo scholar last week in India Habitat Center. He said, I am a Tamil from India, I am not Indian. In a similar way, a Mizo guy said last week in Habitat, I am a Mizo from India. But he said, I am not an Indian. So this India, from India, is a much more objective, concrete notion of a state. Whereas the idea that informs and legitimizes that concrete reality called state is called nation in modern times. And that nation in the European sense has a cultural connotations heavily influenced by German romanticists, J.J. Herder, for example, the notion of a folk which speaks a common language constitute a nation, which, by the way, Indians did incorporate. The Sanskrit Commission of 1956 has the similar kind of notion of a linguistic nationalism. So we need to understand this relationship between nation and the state, how they came into being together. In a simpler form, state is a concrete, objective, juridico-political institutions, where the nation is a subjective, psychological, cultural conception. Why do the modern state requires nation? One simple way of looking at it is, earlier the state was defined the sovereign power of the king. As simple as that. So the idea of a divine rule, the idea of a charismatic leader and so forth legitimizes the power of the state. But something happened in what we call it emergence of the modernity in Europe. This particular paradigm was broken down, and thereby emerges the idea called popular sovereignty, the notion of we the people. Now, even a military dictator today will not be able to say that in the name of my army or in the name of my khandan, he will not say. He will always say in the name of the nation, in the name of we the people. Because in short, modern state legitimizes itself, its exercise of power through the idea of the people, which is again interpreted as the nation. And that comes very clearly in French Declaration's Article 3, where it says sovereignty rests with the nation. And that's where the nation and the state conflicts. And now what happened is, this particular nation, which legitimizes the state, is produced in a cultural sphere predominantly through two ways. One is civilization, the other is what we call history. Now, civilization and history are also critically related, as Andrei Subramanian pointed out, that the civilization is the key matrix of historiography. I'll just try to explain it again. When the Europeans comes, a typical Hegelian notion of the non-European people as historyless people, people without civilization and so forth, it's a blank space. And that was what countered by any nationalist which is rooted in anti-imperial colonial movement in Africa and Asia. And that is why Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay says what they call India used to be called Bharatvarsha, and we have a civilization, Nehru again, in discovering their 5,000 years old civilizations. So in order to recover themselves from a state of being invisible in the eyes of the European, they started claiming that we have a history, we have in a nation, we have in a civilization, and so on and so forth. So one of the civilizational axes for political movement in India is the notion of the Indic civilization, which is 5,000 years old or so. Now, it is this particular civilization, once we do a critical reading of it, converts slowly into a Hindu civilization. In the process, I'm cutting short because I can answer it in detail of that. There is a transformation of this Indic civilization from saying Indic to Indian civilization or Hindu civilization. And since that particular transformation happens, particularly in the 18th century, 19th century onwards, the idioms used by the nationalists, Gandhi for instance, Ram Rajya, Tilak's introductions of Ganpati festival as a part of nationalist mobilizations, the idiom of Bharat Mata, the imageries of a goddess-like figure, this 19th century and 20th century nationalist idioms of Indian nationhood isolated the Muslims and the Dalits. And that is why by 1930s, the so-called secular Indian nationalism had to face Ambedkar as well as Jinnah in different forms. That is because of a deeply rooted Indic civilization which has been reinterpreted as Hindu civilization and so on and so forth. In short, there is a sectarian inflection of upper caste Brahminical elements in the articulation of the Indian nationhood. And that remains. That is there again in 1956 Sanskrit Commission report. We can see in various texts, even in Perry Anderson's work, he quotes it very clearly. That is the particular Hindu. Ambedkar was one guy who tried to change that situation, but he was sort of suppressed, sidelined through, we know in Indian history how he was sidelined through Gandhi, Nehru, and Patel. And he was a figure that could have given a different notion of India. In Aloysius' work, for instance, he was arguing nationalism without nation. For Gandhi, reproducing the same structures. There was not a radical departure from the old traditions, and we did not create a nation. We don't have a nation. That was one of his central theses in his work. Now, this particular inflection is done in that particular transformation of the civilization, and this civilization is part of historiography. Second point, how? You open a textbook of school textbook, history of India. It starts with Stone Age, then in Harappan civilizations, then Indo-Gangetic Bale. You have a particular temporal framing it. A civilization has been, in a very critical sense, is the key matrix of the way you write history. Back in Manipur, see yourself. The moment people like Pahari and others, Pahari went out in the 60s and they discovered themselves that they had not been recognized, they don't know where Manipur is, and so on and so forth. That sense of humiliation of being an absentee in the imagination of the so-called Indian nation state. Similar kind of experience by the nationalists in South Asia a century or a couple of centuries ago was exactly the same thing. That's how Lasnaza was first volume, Manipur past and present. He said, we have been a civilization, much older perhaps than the Indic and so on and so forth. This particular discursive requirement of recovering an absent into a present is part of the nationalist imagination. That remains still, and Manipuri's nationalism, since I've just mentioned it, the so-called territorial integrity and others, one of the things that we have not been able to address is that there is a deep military inflection in the way Manipur nationalism is articulated. And that is exactly the problem that we have not been able to see. And that is a similar kind of problem the Indian state faces. For instance, if I can give you a concrete, the Santosh Trophy, Manipur state won the trophy for the first time. The players have a victory lap in the stadium, and they were carrying 7 colors flag. And that stands for 7 exiles of the Meiteis. It doesn't even include some of the Meiteis like Khetri and Lariki and Gomso and so forth, and forget about the Brahmins and the Muslims of Bangladesh state. Forget about him. And that particular kind of a thing we have not been able to reimagine in a very different manner, and that's the kind of level. Today we keep on producing historical math. It is almost reminiscent of the right-wing Hindu RSS who says Akhand Bharat runs from Afghan to Cambodia. And that kind of a feeling is not going to justify. We must realize that what Manipur faces today is the notion of we the people. The modern paradigm of running a polity. We have failed to generate, and there are reasons I'm not going to go into it here because it's not related. But if you ask me the question, I can come back to it. Now, very slowly, how this history is produced. I have said it is civilization and how it is related. The second one is, this is what the subaltern historians have been saying. A story of a site has become the story of the entire Indian space. In short, we have Manipur, see, closer home. We have Kangla, we have Moirang Kanglayo, we have Kuman, all of them. But the history of Manipur is articulated through this Pakhang Batu, the present king. So that particular thing silences a lot of other histories. And in a very similar sense, Indian history is also produced a singularity. Actually, Patu Chatterjee uses this word. He said, the singularity of nationalist historiography. That's what Patu Chatterjee calls it. And that singularity is what is produced by silencing a lot of other side stories. And Patu Chatterjee gave a very important example, for instance. In Bengal, in the 19th century, in the beginning part of the 19th century, Mughals were never villain in their narratives. It is always the Afghans, for example. But by the end of the 19th century, the story of Indo-Gangetic period of Punjab, Delhi area, where Mughal is presented as a villain, also became the villain for the Bengalis. That's how their history has been silenced, replaced by a story of the others. And that's a nationalist project of historiography. So through this, India produces a deeply rooted Hindu civilization as the backbone of imagining India. That's why one is not able to say, I am an Indian from India. Why one keeps on saying that I am a Tamil from India. I can accept the state at one level, at the political category, perhaps, if not the state, but never this civilizational cultural assumption that informs the Indian state. And that's the statement that one must try to understand. What happens here? Just as the Muslims and Dalits were excluded from this imagination, the Northeast, how it gets excluded is where I want to come, just before I touch the last point. How the Northeast is excluded is because just as the European arrived here, for them Asia is largely two civilizations. One they call it Indic civilization, the other they call it Sinic civilization, that is the Chinese civilization. And interestingly, particularly among the Dutch scholars and French scholars, Southeast Asia is a tabula rasa. It doesn't have a civilization of its own. They carry the imprints of the visiting civilization, particularly the Sinic and the Indic. And the Northeast